Welcome, everyone. We appreciate your coming and hope you're enjoying the conference. I'm Eric Kaplan. I'm the director of the Housing Finance Program at the Milken Institute within the Center for Financial Markets. I have three fellows on my team. I want to mention them here: Mike Stegman and Ted Tozer. Phil Swagel couldn't be here, all of whom, in my opinion, are luminaries, and I think in this sector. I'm very privileged to have them on my team, and so wanted to acknowledge them. This panel is a very distinguished panel, like all of the other panels here. This is my first rodeo at the Milken Conference. I joined in September, taking over from this man when he left to run Ginnie Mae as the acting president and EVP and COO. So Michael Bright, thank you for joining us. Carol Galante is the head of the Turner Center and, among many other things, former FHA commissioner as well. And thank you for coming down, Carol. John Barry, the chairman and CEO and founder of Prospect Capital, and a longtime friend and supporter of the Milken Institute, and has done a lot of work with the Institute and with Mike Milken. So, John, thank you.
Thank you, Eric.
Tim Mayopoulos, the CEO of Fannie Mae. So basically the head of the most important and largest mortgage entity in the country today. Longtime mortgage finance and mortgage industry background as well. So Tim, thank you. And last but certainly not least, someone I consider an icon, and I've been privileged to call my chairman prior to the Milken Institute, and someone I've learned a tremendous amount from, and it could go on, but Louis Ranieri. So the father of the mortgage-backed security.
Something.
So I can't help it. You're going to have to deal with this for years, Lou. So the topic here is American homeownership, and do we still have a dream? And the American dream is such it's such a charged term. What does it mean? We're taught from a young age, or we hear so many references to it over the course of the decades of our lives. The housing market in the crisis, we know that it was at the core of the cataclysm. There's so many things to talk about, or so many facets to how and why housing led to or fueled the crisis. And we're still digging out of that. We may be digging out of that for a long time, and yet we still have to maintain a housing market that is sustainable and healthy, and we find ourselves challenged. So before we get into it, I want to start with a little video clip. So please indulge me for about 20 seconds.
Oh, Ginnie! Hey, you rented a new house? Rent? You hear what he said, Mr. Bailey?
What's that?
I own the house. Me, Giuseppe Martini, I own my own house. No more we live like a pigs in this Paris field.
One more.
Marie!
Thank you. Turn it from there. Now we'll see the goat go in the car. So everyone who smiled knows the film, right? But if you know, I was thinking about the panel.
How come you picked an Italian? I'm not.
Yeah. Home ownership, right? We have a self-employed borrower. He owned his own business. He was an immigrant. I mean, there's so much about It's a Wonderful Life. There's a line in there, you know, how to save a nickel on a length of pipe. There's a lot that is embedded in that film that we actually are facing today. Issues about construction costs and whether there's available housing and affordability of rentals or ownership, and that's what we really want to dig in today. So also that's my favorite film, so thank you for indulging me. And we are in Hollywood, so you know. So I want to start with you, Lou, and one of the first things you talked about when we met was the virtuous housing circle, or the virtuous housing cycle, and what it looks like in a healthy market. And maybe you can layer that or into that where we are now and why it's broken.
Well, first let me remind everybody when we talk about this, what we're talking about shelter being a requirement of a civilized society. Whether we provide it through multifamily or single family, the object is to provide shelter. And it's not that it's broken. It's that in various aspects of the way we're attempting to provide shelter, it's not working. I mean, workforce housing is in very short supply. At the bottom end, you know, housing for lower and really low income people is really in short supply. And the dream of housing was damaged dramatically by the series of events in 2009. And people now frequently ask, you know, there's actually been papers written about, do we really need housing? Is housing a problem? Our host here, Mike Milken, really struggles over whether housing is you know, an abscess on the economy, that it draws so much resources that it weakens the whole system. And my answer is, okay, what's the alternative? Remember, we have to provide shelter. And by the way, yes, we have more single-family housing in this country than anywhere else. Much of the rest of the world does not have the same percentage of home ownership we have. But the people here choose it as a lifestyle. And it has been a way to wealth for many people over many generations. You know, yes, we went wrong, but Tim may disagree with me about this. When I look at the crisis, and having, you know, created structures, I sort of feel, I always feel guilty about what happened, but nonetheless, it wasn't housing that was the problem. In fact, most of it was the financial structures. You know, we were using structures which from the get-go we all knew were unsafe, and were making bets on outcomes that were not necessarily true. And we were selling houses to people, not that selling houses to people is wrong, but we were selling them houses they couldn't ultimately afford, which is the greatest evil. I mean, I'm taking too much time, but I'll say one last thing. The most terrible experience of my life was having to tell a father, now this was a family where the wife and the husband and wife both work. They have 3 kids, and they bought a big house. And they bought that big house in a, you know, one of these structures which just takes the value of the house and keeps adding into the future. In other words, instead of charging the real monthly constant, they were in effect amortizing the monthly constant into the future. So it looked like they could afford the house. You know, assuming rates didn't go up, assuming property values didn't do anything but go up, they may be able, but the odds were so heavily against it that it was obvious that they had been sold a house they truly could not afford. But these were hard-working people, and they put all of the money they had down. It happened to only be 5%, but it was all they had. And I had to tell them that they were so far under, the house value was so far down, and they were so far away from a debt service constant that they could really afford, you know, that it just didn't work. Unless the bank wanted to give them the house, you couldn't restructure it. So I had to tell this father that he was going to go home and tell his wife and his 3 kids that unless there was a miracle, which had nothing to do with economics, had to do with the bank just willing to write off the loan, they were going to have to move.
Yeah. And you know,
that was the most terrible experience of my life, okay? And so, but it wasn't housing. It was the financial engineering that had gone completely crazy. And it's important to really remember that, because you know, when we want to run away from housing or run away from the requirement to provide shelter all the way down to the lowest portion, we have to not confuse the engineering with the purpose. And now I'll shut up. Sorry.
It's anything you want to say, Lou, is always welcome. But you touch on something that Mike Milken has talked about and is very near and dear to him, but he's talked about it for years, is what choices are we making in housing? There's 2 elements of this. There's housing, and as Lou points out, there's housing finance. Those are 2 different things. When we talk, you know, so many people, there's about 50 or 100 new data points per day about home ownership, and it's mind-boggling. It's wherever you look, there's a new statistic, and it really it saturates the landscape. But there's access to housing, and then there's access to the credit to afford the housing, and that's of real concern. And there are dynamics of both that are raising the challenges that we see today. Tim, we talked a bit about this. If you can speak to that, that would be great.
Sure. So thank you. Look, I think it's important, as you say, to differentiate between housing and housing finance. And you know, Eric, you used the word broken with respect to housing, and I think I agree with Lou. I'm not sure that housing is broken. I'm not even sure at this point that housing finance is broken. Both of them have serious problems, but I think using words like broken kind of doesn't help to illuminate the issues. It kind of obfuscates the issues. Right. In terms of housing, you know, there's a serious shortage of affordable housing, as Lou says. The reality is that as a country, we don't have a national housing strategy or policy. We just don't have one. We came through the crisis saying that lots of people who used to own homes probably shouldn't have been in those homes, and yet we haven't really done anything to figure out, if they're not going to live in houses that they own, what kind of properties are there available for them to affordably rent. And so the real challenge here is around affordability. So, you know, on the other hand, to my point that housing is not necessarily broken, 10 years ago housing was broken. I mean, it was in free fall and things were in really bad shape. We've seen 5 or 6 years of home price appreciation, which is a good thing as a general matter. We've seen functioning markets. You know, we have market clearing events. We have liquid markets in housing. Housing finance has recovered as well in terms of we've set credible, sustainable credit standards, and they are being enforced. We are being much more transparent, to Lou's point, about what the risks are in that. We're now able to technologically verify data around borrower income and assets and collateral values before loans are even closed, let alone delivered into the secondary market in a way that we never could before. And we can then use that same data to sell credit risk or transfer credit risk to investors away from taxpayers who want to take on that risk. So those are all significant improvements. The real challenge is around affordability, and the real challenge around affordability is around supply. And we shouldn't try to solve the supply issue by eroding credit standards. We need to sustain reasonable credit standards, but we need to address the supply problem. And the supply problem is a function of several things. If you sit around and talk to home builders or apartment developers, it's really around land acquisition costs. It's around labor shortages. They just don't have the labor at a reasonable price to build these homes. It's also around the regulatory burden. We all want to have safe homes, but we keep layering regulatory requirements on, and much of that's being done at the local level, which is really impeding the development of affordable housing. So we need to figure out how to combine a sensible housing finance strategy with a real housing strategy that says, what are we going to do to stimulate more of that supply? And I do think that if affordability is the great challenge, I think that innovation and technology is the great opportunity. If you look at what's going on in terms of new designs around home construction, I think housing construction costs are going to come down very significantly with modular homes and other kinds of things. I mean, I was in Austin, Texas last week and saw the first 3D printed house. These two guys built in their backyard. Can they roll it out today and build lots of houses with it? No, but it actually was permitted, and it meets the Austin City Code. And they built a house in 47 hours. It's a little house, but it's 47 hours, and they built it for $30,000. There is opportunity in that. So I think what we really need to do is focus on how do we increase supply, but I'm optimistic that some of these technological innovations will help us get there.
That's great. So I want to break this down then for the panel, and Carol, if I can turn to you in a moment. You've got supply challenges, right? Let's call it housing stock, affordability, and technology. So for many of the people in this room, if not at this conference, housing, it really isn't an issue. You have access to credit. We have some very wealthy people here where they can make financial decisions as if they're operating a company balance sheet. They know if they want to access credit, they can do it. If they want to pay cash, they can do it. The people at the lower end of the spectrum may not, and there are elements of housing, in terms of inventory, in terms of costs that are making, so point taken about broken, but there are dislocations or there are challenges, let's put it that way, at different parts of the market where people are most likely to find themselves challenged. And maybe it doesn't concern many of the people at this conference, but we have family members, friends, employees who really struggle with this. And Carol, if you can talk a bit about that, that would be great.
Sure. So, I've spent most of my career actually developing, building, owning rental housing for people at the very low end of the income spectrum. And I would just say supply issues and the cost of producing that supply is a huge challenge right now. And Tim is absolutely right. There's a lot of opportunity for improvement with technology. I actually sit on an advisory board for a startup modular company that I think is going to clearly be able to reduce the cost by 20 to 30% and build it faster. So I agree with all those barriers on supply that creates affordability. At the same time, there are people, the most vulnerable in our society, who at the very low income end of the spectrum will always need some subsidy from the government to afford housing. Just if you think about what it costs to maintain in your typical apartment building, if you're very low income, you can't pay enough rent to afford the most basic, just paying the operating expenses on a building. But so I think all that is true, and it's a big challenge, and I'm happy to talk more about that later. But I just want to tag on to the rental versus home ownership conversation and what's broken in the system, and take us back much farther to your video, clip, because yes, it was an immigrant with a independent business who was very excited he was able to access home ownership. But even at that time, we had unequal access in this country to home ownership. We had redlining, we had government, official government policy at the Federal Housing Administration, which I ultimately ran, that redlined entire neighborhoods, that basically said if that neighborhood was not homogeneous in its population of white people, then you could not get a mortgage in that location. So we have generations of African Americans in particular, but other minority groups too, that have frankly been out and out shut out. And if you could put up that slide, Eric, on homeownership rates.
Yep. Please, if you could put up slide 8, please. Slide 7.
We have actually done, in this country, a heck of a job providing home ownership, even through the crisis and post-crisis, to white families. But look at the differential in home ownership rates, roughly 70% for white families, somewhere, declined during the recession, but essentially declining for African Americans from what already was a low in the mid-40s to even lower. And so I guess what I think is broken, and coming back to kind of housing finance and government policy, this is immoral and unequal, and we have got to do something in this country to enable a broader set of people to be able to access home ownership the way my parents could. My father did not graduate, Italian immigrant, did not graduate from high school, worked a construction job, and he was able to get a low down payment, probably through the VA, we're not sure, low down payment loan, and move his family to one of the best suburban school districts in the state of Pennsylvania. And if I had been black, I would not have had that opportunity. This was a generational challenge and an ongoing challenge that I think we, in all the housing finance reform discussions and all what is the role of access to credit, we simply do not go back to our discriminatory history and say we need a more level playing field in housing access for home ownership, because it is the single greatest wealth creation for for most Americans. And so, we are just doing a disservice if we don't address that. And that's not to say that given where we are demographically with all the baby boomlets, my children, who are all forming households, we have a huge rental problem as well, particularly in the cities. And we could talk about that more as well.
Right. Actually, if you can go to the next slide as well, and then I want to ask John a question. Take a look here also. This is 100 U.S. cities with the largest black populations. If you look at the gaps, the widest gaps and the smallest gaps, even in the smallest gaps between white and black home ownership, is still a significant difference. But we look at home ownership rates, and we have to think, I think, in the context of how we got to these rates. Carol brought up, it goes way back, right? There's dynamics that have been perpetuated in society that we have been trying to address. But think about the crisis. How many African American families were devastated by the subprime crisis and lost their homes?
Correct.
And whether because of credit standards or lack of income lack of assets for down payment, or the fact that they were unemployed, could not attain home ownership in what is now the longest run-up since 2012. It's a seller's market, one of the longest home price appreciation periods in history. And so they have not been able to participate in that wealth building. But John, we had talked about this, that so many people focus on the home ownership rate and say it's the lowest percentage it's been in decades, 50 years. And yet we're at 63.5%, and it's compared to 68 or 69%. And there's a difference, I think, in looking at the percentage versus looking at the question of whether or not housing is available or options to own homes is available, as opposed to a percentage itself. And John, do you want to talk a bit about that? The difference between percentage versus the question of housing?
Sure. I was talking to one of my children the other day who was speaking to the head of our real estate division at our company. And this person, Ted Fowler, is well known to many of us. He ran First Boston years ago. And he said, well, it's a good thing that home ownership percentages are down and more people are renting, because that's the in thing for millennials, is to rent in the shared economy. And my son James said, Dad, that's actually not really what's happening. We just can't afford to buy a house. Okay. So a couple of things, though, about what's been said. I remember in the discussions of healthcare and discussions of home ownership and economic opportunity, I heard it said often that the best health policy is a good job, paying a good wage. And I think also the best path to home ownership is a good job, paying a good wage. And so I'm thinking right now we have according to the figures, the lowest black unemployment rate in the history of our country, the lowest Hispanic unemployment rate. We have real wage growth at a greater rate than we've had in 8 or 9 years. So I think that I look to something like that, I consider myself an equilibrium free market economist. And when I see the economy is providing jobs, good jobs, and the unemployment rate for all sector, all groups is declining, that to me is encouraging. I am skeptical of a policy goal to increase from 63 to 64 to 65 to 66% the numbers of people that own their own home. And it's for a couple of reasons. One is very personal. I lost one of the closest people to me in my entire life to a home that he could not afford, that he did not know how to take care of, that he stressed over. And I know as a homeowner, there's a lot of work that's involved. It's not just a mortgage. It's not just the local taxes. It's the roof, it's the plumbing, it's the boiler. And every time something happens, you discover that it's expensive to fix, even the smallest thing. And so I do wonder whether a policy goal seeking to achieve ever higher home ownership is really good for people. So on that, though, I have a couple other items, and that is not everyone can afford a home, and especially not everyone can afford a home in certain areas. But in certain other areas, maybe people can. And I have a few statistics here. The mean price of a home in San Jose, $1.25 million. In Indianapolis, $122,000. Median income in San Jose, $77,000. In Indianapolis, $56,000. So in San Jose, a person has to, a median home is 16.23 times the median income, whereas in Indianapolis, it's 2.2 times. So amazingly, you have 25% appreciation in the last year on the median home in San Jose, 5.1% in Indianapolis. So to some extent, I think people make choices, can make more intelligent choices of where to live, where the cost of housing is more in line with the prevailing incomes.
Yeah. If you could turn to slide, I think it is because these were renumbered. What are we looking at here? Slide number, I think it's 3. Or 5, actually 5. Slide 5. There we go. To John's point, that you take a look here, and I don't want people to, very careful about the slides. We don't want people to get lost in the colors and the charts and the graphs. But basically what this is saying is during the home price run up, the seller's market of the last 5 or 6 years, and this slide's a little dated, but this holds true. You look at the percentage increase of prices at the lower tier of the market versus the middle and higher tiers. And some of the reasons for this go to things like we're talking about construction costs have been mentioned a few times. The base construction cost, what is it, Lou, 85,000 or something?
Yeah,
just permitting and zoning.
That is the number, 85.
Yeah, before you even get to construction costs. And so if you're a builder, you've got, in order to make money, it's more worth your while to build homes. There's a dearth of construction workers. If you look at the number of construction companies from just before during the boom or just before the crash till now, it's halved. And so the shortage of homes, Tim mentioned inventory before. We've got too much supply, and we've got not enough supply and too much demand, and it'll take several years for that to right itself. The issue is, if you look at this, as we're looking to expand credit, and I'm going to turn to Mike in a moment, the more borrowers that come in at the lower end of the spectrum, and that's where the supply is the least, it puts pressure on home prices. They rise, and so homes become less affordable. And so, this.
So
Eric,
on this point, I mean, this problem is only going to get worse.
Yeah.
And everyone focuses on the baby boomers and the impact that they had on housing, but the millennial generation is even bigger than the baby boom generation, right? And despite what people think, all the studies that we do at Fannie Mae do not suggest that millennials want to rent. They all aspire to own their own homes at the same rate as prior generations.
I completely agree with that.
I mean, the statistics show that. That's what the surveys show. Now, whether they'll actually be able to act on that aspiration is a whole nother thing. But they also aspire not to live in apartments that they own, but they actually aspire to live in single-family homes that they own. So this challenge is only going to get greater as this very big snake, a very big pig goes to this snake, because millennials are going to put huge pressure on this first-time homebuyer segment, and it runs the risk of running these prices up even higher. And to Carol's point about the demographics, 75% of the people between the ages of 18 and 34 are non-whites. Okay, so not only are these home prices going to continue to go up at the starter entry level, but it's going to disproportionately impact people of color. So this is not a problem that's just going to get solved in the next 2 or 3 years. We're not going to find equilibrium, in my view, in the next 2 or 3 years on this challenge. I think there's some structural things happening in the economy that are going to exacerbate this.
So then taking that, and Michael, I want to ask you, putting into perspective the fact we're talking about two things, right? Thinking about whether or not homes are available for people who would like to own homes, and then the question of whether or not they can afford them in a sustainable, responsible way. That calls into question the housing finance system and mechanisms within the finance system that we can use to address that or to identify problems that we need to address, and the question of risk. So.
Yeah, so I've been waiting patiently, so now I'm going to talk for a long time.
So what's new?
Well, the waiting patiently is actually new. So here's something that I don't think we do in this country, and we need to do more of it. And I'm very happy, Eric, to tie this exactly back to your movie, It's a Wonderful Life. And I would bring in the subsequent scenes and then, more importantly, subsequent policy. So after the scene where the guy buys a home, we have the financial calamity in 1929, and there's the run on the banks, and you know, people are worried about losing their homes, and you end up in this Great Depression, right? All of that happens. And then what steps do we take? Well, FDR in Congress creates Fannie and Ginnie. So we're creatures of Congress created by elected officials to fulfill a public mission, which is in America, we've decided we want to have access to homes, access to home ownership for the Italian immigrant and everybody else. And we want to do it without the risk of the financial crisis that takes place later in the movie that causes all the sort of widespread misery and human suffering that these crises do. And that was the objective of these policies. And that's great. And I think that in some ways that's worked. However, we don't have an intellectually honest conversation with ourselves in this country, in this realm, on two areas that bother me. Number one, industry participants in the mortgage market don't take seriously enough, in my view, the fact that they're operating in an industry that was created in the wake of those events with the mission and the goals of both making sure that you can provide access to home ownership without creating systemic crises. Meaning we live in an ecosystem. If you're in the mortgage market, you have chosen to work in an ecosystem that is created, subsidized, basically owned and operated and handed to you in some form by the federal government. And that's fine. That's great. I think the government has a giant role to play in this market. And I think that people who want to get involved in it for profit-making endeavors have a role to play as well. But have a healthy respect for the fact that if you're in the mortgage market, you have duty, you have some sort of obligation, duty and honor, whatever, to the fact that you're operating in the system that was created with public purpose in mind. And I think that we lost that. Everybody lost that in 2000, starting in, I don't know, 99, 2000, and it caused the financial crisis. And I have concern that we're back there again. And I want to get back to that point. The other intellectual dishonesty, I think, is that Americans need to understand that they have access to home ownership because their policies are subsidized. And that's white Americans too. And there's a cognitive disconnect on their part where it's, we saw this in 2008 with the rant on the floor, the Santelli rant or whatever. It was like, oh, I'm paying my mortgage and these guys are, I'm like, but your mortgage is subsidized too. So like, we're all in this system together, right? Everybody in this country who has a 3 1/8% 30-year fixed rate prepayable mortgage has it because it's subsidized, because we've built the system. So we all have responsibility. If we're all in this country going to want to live in a world where mortgages are subsidized and we don't want a financial crisis, take that risk seriously. That's what stymied the ability, the regulatory reform efforts and legislative reform efforts, is that no one wants to be honest about that. That's why we had financial crisis, because I don't think that industry participants were taking that seriously enough. I would say this, this is personal for me. I saw this, I worked at Countrywide, I left in 2006 because I said, this company's going under. There's no chance this is sustainable. I went to Wachovia because they didn't have West Coast real estate, and a week later they bought Golden West. And then I lost my job there. And so I came to Washington, and now I'm in Washington and in a privileged position to run Ginnie because the dum-dums in...
Remind me not to follow you, Michael.
And Ginny's about to, no. No, so for the transition folks were, wrong enough to accept Ted's resignation letter. So now I'm stepping in to run Ginnie, and I'm kind of like, well, this is not happening on my watch. Okay, we're not going through this again. We're going to operate in an ecosystem where we all take these risks seriously. We talk to each other, we share with each other, and we make sure that we understand that we have a responsibility to not perpetuate this cycle of crisis. And my last point, the note that I have is one of concern, and that when I say that to market participants, our issuers or lenders, they look at me like I have 6 heads. And I've literally in the last week had conversations with some of our issuers where I said, I'm not so sure that your balance sheet is, as good as it should be, and you've got responsibilities in the Ginnie program, they're P&I. Have you ever taken a look at how you'd weather a storm if mortgage production fell in 50%? And a guy said to me, well, I would just mail you the keys. I'm not going to be in this business if mortgage production falls 50%. And that's the attitude that, Dodd-Frank and post-crisis, we fixed QM and we fixed underwriting standards, and I think Fannie and Freddie are better run than they have been in decades, but it's that attitude that is going to kill this market. And it can't, if you want to have that attitude in something that's, off some libertarian Ayn Rand world where you can say, well, I'll live with the risk and I'll live with the downside, that's fine. But in the mortgage market, when you step in, you stepped into an ecosystem that is based out of public policy, and we need to talk to each other more about that. That's what worries me.
Go ahead, John, please.
I would just like to briefly address the assertion that I've heard several times now that owning a home is a path to wealth creation in the United States. I know in my case, the home that I purchased in 1985 is worth way less than what I would have had I taken the down payment and put it into the S&P 500. So let me just read something. We'll see who can guess who wrote this. Research by Nobel economist Robert Shiller shows that U.S. housing prices declined in about half of the years since 1890. While U.S. stocks during those years enjoyed an average real rate of return of about 6% a year, the annual inflation-adjusted return on houses was a meager 0.18%. Factor in real estate's heavy transaction costs, and that number turns negative. So the concept that owning a home is a great economic investment, I think, is belied by abundant data, and it's not even close.
Can I just,
Yeah.
Go
ahead, please.
and maybe tie Michael's comments with your comments, because I absolutely agree. We don't agree on everything, but I totally agree that we have a shared responsibility, given that the government has made a decision way back to subsidize home ownership in this country in lots of different ways, from the mortgage interest deductions to capital gains exclusions to the mortgage finance system. Okay, we have a very subsidized home ownership market. And to your point, I would just say, if you think about the stock market versus home equity, you're starting from a position that you had as an individual, an alternative to invest in stocks. And I think that's the fallacy, right? I mean, during the financial crisis and stock market went down like 800 points in one day, I remember talking to my very working class brother who's a truck driver. It's like, didn't bother him. Didn't bother him. He has no pension. He worked paycheck to paycheck. Where was he going to have money to put in the stock market to care that it went down? Where was he going to have money to put in the stock market, to take advantage of appreciation? Most Americans are working paycheck to paycheck. Right. And so the subsidization of home ownership has actually given that average individual the ability to at least have the opportunity, if done right, in terms of the credit standards and whatnot, to actually build wealth, by paying, a very little bit, on an amortized basis over a long period of time to create that wealth. And then some people got really lucky if they bought that $20,000 house in Burlingame or San Mateo or somewhere down here, pick a nice place. that they bought for $20,000 in the 1940s and 50s that's now worth, $5 million. The same person could have bought $20,000 house in Akron, Ohio, like my husband's family, and maybe it's worth $85,000 today. So geography and jobs, make a big difference in how much wealth creation your home is going to enable. But I think it's really hard to refute that it has, for most average Americans, being the single biggest wealth creation opportunity.
So, but isn't this a little bit of a, speaking for myself, I'm not here advocating that home ownership is the right answer for everybody.
I agree.
I actually don't hear most of the people up here saying that. My issue is that if people aren't going to live in homes that they own, they need access to homes that they can rent. And as a society, as a country, we're not doing a very good job of creating access to affordable housing that people can rent, as well as not creating much access for people to homes that they can own. So,
don't we have? Is there also pressure in the rental supply at the lower end of the spectrum as well?
Huge,
Tremendous.
It is. We at Fannie Mae, 90% of what we finance on the rental side, on the apartment side, and we're one of the biggest financiers in that space, is affordable to people at up to 120% of area median income, right? So that's nurses and firefighters and truck drivers and police officers and folks like that. So that's what we're focused on financing. But the reality is that for most people in the apartment business, it is much, much, much more profitable for them to build and operate apartments in high-cost areas and supply-constrained markets. So it makes every economic sense in the world to develop apartments in places like New York and San Francisco and LA and other high-cost constrained markets. It doesn't make as much sense to build a garden-style apartment in Akron, Ohio, or Birmingham, Alabama, or someplace like that. And that's the challenge, is that we're not, as a country, we're not solving either one of these options. We're not solving the home ownership option, and we're not solving the rental option.
Yeah, can you put slide 9, actually, please? Just to your point, Tim, just on the apartments, if you take a look, this is just, if you look at the new construction, it falls within luxury and middle income. It's, again, back to houses as well. What's being built? And it goes back to the beginning of what we talked about, the housing circle, whether it's ownership or rental. If you're just starting out, and again, Mike Milken talks about this all the time, are you moving into what used to be a 1,500 square foot home because that's what you can afford and you're not pressuring yourself when it comes to your housing costs?
There are no 1,500 square foot
That's
homes.
right.
That's the problem.
Now they're 2,500.
That used to be the entry. That happened to be exactly what the entry level used to be.
Right.
It's now like 2,500 or 2,600.
Yeah. And to Carol's point, there's a staggering statistic that I think it's over half of individuals or families or homes could not afford a $400 external event, a broken refrigerator, without having to sell or borrow. Right, that's a staggering figure, especially for the people who are here at this conference. But if you put that in the context of one other figure too, which is what is about 30 or 40% of people spend over 30% on a gross basis, is even before taxes, on their housing costs. And about half of those, it's over 50%. And if you just do the math when it comes to your median income, and you put geography on top of that, if you layer it on top, you get people who are cost constrained. And when you put that in the context of affordability, and going back to Michael's point, how does a home become affordable? The price drops, or you have assets to put down so that you can then afford the monthly payment, or you extend credit. And so you start extending credit or having low down payments so that people start to get shoehorned into credit they may not be able to sustain. Welcome to 2006 and 7. But Lou, think about when you started, and what were mortgage rates in the 70s?
Or
60, and then the system. That
I remember,
founded, right?
Thanks to my good friend Carter, I remember we had more Ginnie Mae's at 10%.
Yeah. Imagine what affordability would be like if we went back to those rates, and how many people would be shut out because they couldn't afford. Think about the problems we have now. So Lou, the system that you created by opening up the secondary market, it has worked for decades. But
I would tell you, yes, I created the system. I actually even wrote the rules. But the fact was, I never intended taking the portfolio lenders out of the system. I never intended a system that is entirely dependent on securities. I was not looking to displace the local portfolio lender, the thrifts and the credit unions, who I think have a tremendous role to play in solving this problem. Tim, am I saying something you don't agree with?
No, I think that's absolutely right. And one of the things we try to do is to serve all those
I know you do.
all those small players, and but it's so I don't disagree at all.
This is like a little bit tied to my point about intellectual honesty and the fact that we don't have that in public policy making when it comes to housing. I think to level set, this is not going to be an anti-Dodd-Frank. I think Dodd-Frank did a heck of a lot of really, really important and great things. But why did in financial regulation we had reform, and in housing we haven't? We've got sort of more evolution. Because it was easy for Congress to pass a bunch of new rules and tell regulators, I want you to write these new rules, and I want them to do X, Y, and Z. When you do it, don't have this unintended consequence. And so there are some fallacies to it, and the regulators have struggled with it. But regulation, boom, we get reform, no problem. Housing, people haven't been able to kind of do it. And the reason is that we don't want to have an honest conversation about the fact that accomplishing some of the objectives in housing means having some of the difficult decisions and asking some of the tough questions. And so we've re-regulated the banking industry, and we haven't done anything in the housing industry. And the thing that's transpired in sort of the behind the scenes is that the banks have gotten out of lending because of in some part because of the regulations, in some part because of the hangover, in some part because they're not as good of it as the monoline non-banks. But now we've got a whole system built on a different set of players who are wholly dependent on the securitization infrastructure in order to operate. And I think that is one of the, an outcome of the fact that both when Dodd-Frank was happening and in the 10 years since, we haven't been willing to have an open conversation with the political economy of the United States and the choices that we've made to build this housing system. So I would love to have a world where banks were back in the lending business. I would love to have a world where mortgage rates reflected the actual credit risk that's there. I would love for securitization to be a mechanism for raising capital when needed, but not what the entire system is dependent upon. And I would love for people who are servicers to be good at the operations of servicing. But to do that, we all have to be honest with each other. We all have to sit down and really work this out, because this is 20% of the economy that we've created, and we talk past each other, and it's siloed and not always sort of just thoughtful and organized.
Well, just as far as not talking past each other, Carol, I was giving the example where somebody, instead of putting a down payment for a home, invested it in the stock market. And I just think the data is irrefutable. It's a 0.18% real return. Sure, there's going to be variation around the mean, but to promote the idea to everyone in America that owning a home is a path to wealth creation, just because there's some anecdotal person here or there who made money, I don't think is proper. Anyway, I'd like to just go in a slightly different direction here. I think a very serious problem that demands a very serious attention is the high level of homelessness amongst our veterans. And frankly, anybody who doesn't have any home, no home to rent, let alone own. No place to go at night, no place to put your stuff. Yes, much of it is related to mental illness, but there are people who just simply lack the means to rent anything. As millennials know, many of them do not have the security deposit. Sometimes it's 2 months. That's a lot of money. And the idea that somebody would sign up for our armed forces and go far away to live in a zone of danger and perhaps give up his or her life and then come home and not have a place to live, I think is truly a shame. And I think a lot more needs to be done about that.
So two things just from a time perspective. I want to leave time for one or two questions at the end. But it goes back to the point in terms of who can afford what. you know, think about it. There are people who can choose to put $1 down in the stock market or on a down payment or a monthly payment. And that's part of the problem that arises from that, John. I think is that if we don't have homes or rentals that are affordable, where people aren't coming out of pocket too much, they can't make that choice. And it's the folks who get in trouble at the lower end of the income spectrum who can't make that choice. But real quickly, Michael, because in terms of addressing and helping veterans, just took a very big step in Ginnie to, you know, exercise some very important oversight. So if you can talk to that, I want to take 30 seconds, then each person give a couple of final thoughts, and then open up to a question.
Well, I mean, I can do it quickly. I mean, you know, the VA space, we have a lot of veterans. And a very friendly lending program that the VA has designed, and those loans end up getting put into Ginnie Mae securities. It's an interesting dichotomy because you have hardly any delinquency rates, very, very low delinquency rates in the VA program. And my understanding is that that's because when veterans leave and they go to begin their civil service and to take advantage of the earned benefits that they have, their officers tell them, this is an earned benefit, you have to pay it forward by, you know, making sure you pay your mortgage on time every month. That's how the VA program survives, and that's great. The problem is there are lenders who aren't operating with any of the same sense of duty and honor, and so we're actually seeing shades of predatory lending come up in, of all places, in the VA lending space. And you have lenders who are originating mortgages that are high WAC, cash out refi mortgages that are a higher interest rate. They know they're a higher interest rate than the borrower needs to pay. And they know that they're going to originate this loan, they're going to put it into Ginnie security, they're going to sell it at a dollar price of 106, they're going to book 6 points of gain on sale, and then probably 3 months later that veteran is going to get a solicitation for a rate that's more in line with what they should have. Then that veteran's going to refinance, and so we're seeing CPRs at 99 in month 3. And guess what? The original lender who made that veteran a rate that was too high took their 6 points gain on sale and went away. But we live in an ecosystem, as I've said. So that game isn't going to last forever. And so we started to see investors, Chinese, the Japanese, domestic pension funds that said, I'm not going to buy Ginnie at 106 when it's going to prepay. I'm going to get par 3 months later. Someone's got to do something about this. So we have to go to these lenders and say, look, you're not playing by the rules that a multi-issuer pool, you know, type of system would rely on in order to be healthy. So you're in the time-up box. You can't be in the multi-issuer pool. And I think that Tim and his colleagues at Fannie and Freddie folks are going to, you know, learn a little bit about how this thing works when they commingle their securities, because you're not going to have some market discipline to put these prepay speeds, and you're going to have to do it yourself. And so it's all the theme that I'm having of trying to police an ecosystem, trying to say that we are all in this together and we have to treat it that way or else it will break.
So I'll say a quick word. Look, we could spend hours and hours on this and not even begin to unravel the threads that have created this very problematic fabric. But to John's point about homelessness, veterans, children, families, Mike has talked all the time and really just digs into this. The first time I heard him speak, it was inspiring and troubling to know.
Mike Milken, not me.
Mike Milken, that's right. Well, you moved too, Michael. Right. How much is it? It's right. It goes beyond who's living in a home. To lose first point, this is shelter we're talking about. So much happens at the home. Where do people live? Can they go to schools? You have a child who's sunk before they start because some of them don't even have a roof over their head, let alone some live with lead paint, all the way up to people who live in Park Avenue apartments and don't have any financial issues for their entire lives. So it goes to the core of our society and what the next generation, the generation after that will look like. And this is why it's not just about having the four walls and a roof, but it really, Milken Institute is so much about how to increase individual and collective prosperity, and this lies at the heart of it. So 30 seconds and then a question. Are we going to be able to dig ourselves out of this in the next 5 to 10 years, or are we still going to be struggling? About 30 seconds, because I do want to get to a question or two.
5 years is aggressive.
I don't think in 5 or 10 years we're going to dig our way out of it. I do want to end on a more hopeful note, because I feel like this has not been very hopeful in terms of solutions, which is we do have opportunities that could be seized, whether it's technology in underwriting, whether it's technology in the building environment that really do need to be seized. And I am one that is for responsible but innovative financial constructs that are beyond what we've talked about here today, whether it's lease to own, whether it's shared equity products, true shared equity products. And I know, Lou has ideas on all these things, but there are some of these creative solutions out there that just haven't been able to find room at the table, given the crisis and the recovery from it, that I think are important to be raised up.
Thanks, Carol. John?
Okay, I'm going to use my 30 seconds of fame to read the 7 things we can all do to combat veteran homelessness. Number 1, get involved. Find out, are there homeless veterans in your community? Participate in stand-downs. These are outreach events. Many of these veterans are so mentally stressed, they don't know what to do next. You have to go find them in many cases. Help with affordable housing, as we've discussed. Support community efforts. Encourage systematic programs in your area. Promote transportation services. Transportation is vitally important. Public transportation, so these veterans can get to places of affordable housing and still maybe get to work or be able to shop. And lastly, endorse veteran employment. It's amazing, and it's really shocking to me that the veteran unemployment rate is the highest unemployment rate of any group.
Thanks, John. Tim?
So in my role, I work hard not making political predictions and not getting involved in lobbying on policy issues. But, there has been a lot of talk about infrastructure investment in the country. People talk about rebuilding our airports, rebuilding our roads, rebuilding our bridges, increasing transportation. I hope that as part of that debate, people think about housing supply as an infrastructure issue. That if we make a major investment in infrastructure, that there are great opportunities to build affordable and workforce housing solutions into that infrastructure investment. Those things should all go together. It does have to do with things like transportation and education and healthcare. So if we can build sustainable communities, we can solve this problem. But we need to think about it as a major investment in the company's core infrastructure.
That's a great. That is a great point. You should.
Yeah. It's on tape, by the way. Yeah. And Lou?
Yeah, I echo that. It was what excuse me. That's what I was going to say. It has to be a national priority to house the country. You just look at the numbers and you see that we're already behind. We will get farther and farther and farther behind the ability to simply provide decent housing for the population. And of course, what happens when you have that problem, the people at the bottom, normally minorities, get the shortest end of the stick. But it's not just them. We are not producing enough housing, whether it be rental or single family. And we can do it. Tim and I and Mike can start rattling off ways that you can do it. But nobody cares at this point. It is not a national priority. Nobody is attempting to say, we have to house the population. That's my 30 seconds.
Okay. Well, look, no time for a question, huh? All right, this is Los Angeles, like on the Oscars or something. I'm getting the hook, so I apologize. There won't be time for a question, but please come up if you do have one, and maybe the panelists can address it. Just pay attention to this if it doesn't fall into your wheelhouse. If it does, you know how important it is. And folks like the ones on stage, my fellows, I am very happy that they are in the driver's seat trying to solve this, because they bring years and years of expertise and commitment and dedication and a sense of duty and honor.
And some really great research on the Milken in the last couple of years on this topic.
Mr. Brighton DeMarco. Thank you very much.
Good proposals are out there.
That's right. Absolutely. Thank you.